On a bitter January morning in 1882, the residents of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, discovered something that would haunt their small industrial town for generations. Martha Cooperfield, the beloved 34-year-old wife of Mayor Theodore Cooperfield, was found dead in her locked study, clutching a leather-bound journal that authorities immediately confiscated and sealed away. What made her death truly chilling wasn't just the mysterious circumstances. It was the 17 pages of names, dates, and financial transactions written in her meticulous handwriting, documenting what appeared to be a conspiracy involving half the town's most prominent citizens. The coroner's report, filed away in the county archives for over a century, listed her cause of death as heart failure. Yet witnesses described finding her with wide, terrified eyes and ink-stained fingers, as if she had been writing frantically until her final breath. Local authorities claimed the journal contained nothing more than household accounts, but 3 witnesses who saw it before its confiscation swore it detailed secret meetings, unexplained deaths, and enough evidence to destroy Millbrook's entire power structure. What Martha Cooperfield discovered in those final weeks of her life was so dangerous that someone was willing to kill to keep it buried. Before we continue with the story of Martha Cooperfield and the secrets that may have cost her life, I want you to know that this channel is dedicated to bringing you the most chilling historical mysteries from across America. If you're fascinated by these dark tales from our nation's past, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. And I'd love to know, what state or city are you listening from? Leave a comment below and join our community of mystery lovers from coast to coast. The truth about what Martha uncovered begins in the autumn of 1881, when the first strange death occurred in Millbrook, setting off a chain of events that would expose the town's darkest secrets. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, nestled in the coal-rich valleys 40 miles northeast of Pittsburgh, was a town built on both promise and peril in 1881. With a population of just over 3,000 souls, it had grown rapidly during the past decade as the Pennsylvania Railroad extended its lines through the region, bringing with it an influx of German and Irish immigrants seeking work in the expanding coal mines and the town's thriving textile mill. The Susquehanna River wound through the valley like a dark ribbon, its waters turned perpetually gray from the coal dust that settled over everything like a fine shroud. Mayor Theodore Cooperfield had married Martha Henley in 1873, when she was just 25 and he was already establishing himself as one of the town's most influential businessmen. Theodore owned a controlling stake in the Millbrook Textile Company and had political aspirations that extended far beyond their small valley town. Martha, educated at a finishing school in Philadelphia, unusual for women of that era, had initially embraced her role as the mayor's wife, organizing charity events for the growing population of mill workers and their families, and maintaining the social calendar that kept Millbrook's elite connected and cooperative. Their marriage, by all appearances, was one of mutual respect and shared ambition. Martha was known throughout the community for her intelligence and discretion, qualities that made her invaluable to Theodore's political career. She possessed an unusual talent for remembering names, faces, and the intricate web of relationships that governed small-town politics. Neighbors often remarked on her habit of keeping detailed journals, a practice she had maintained since her school days, filling leather-bound books with observations about daily life, local events, and the ever-changing dynamics of Millbrook society. The autumn of 1881 brought unseasonable warmth to western Pennsylvania, followed by an early winter that arrived with brutal suddenness in late November. The contrast seemed to mirror the changing mood in Millbrook itself, where prosperity and progress masked growing tensions between the established Protestant families and the newer Catholic immigrants. Theodore Cooperfield navigated these waters carefully, maintaining his position through a delicate balance of public charm and private negotiations. Martha had grown increasingly quiet during those months, spending more time in her private study, a small room on the second floor of their Victorian home on Elm Street that overlooked the town square. Neighbors noticed that she had begun taking solitary walks along the river in the evenings, something that had never been her habit before. When questioned by concerned friends, she would smile politely and redirect conversations to safer topics like the weather or plans for the upcoming Christmas social season. What no one realized was that Martha Cooperfield had begun to notice patterns, inconsistencies in the stories told by her husband and his associates, discrepancies between public statements and private conversations she overheard during dinner parties and political gatherings. Her analytical mind, sharpened by years of managing household accounts and social obligations, had started connecting dots that others either couldn't see or chose to ignore. The first sign that something was deeply wrong in Millbrook came on October 15, 1881, when Heinrich Zimmermann, a foreman at the textile mill, was found dead at the bottom of Raven's Gorge, a steep ravine that cut through the hills east of town. Heinrich Zimmermann had worked at the Millbrook Textile Company for 8 years, earning the trust of both management and workers through his fair dealing and mechanical expertise. At 42, he was a family man with a wife, Emma, and 3 young children, known throughout the German community for his steady temperament and careful handling of money. He had never been one for drinking or gambling, and had no known enemies among either the workers or management. On the morning of October 15th, Heinrich failed to report for his shift at the mill. This was unprecedented. In 8 years, he had never missed a day without sending word ahead. When the afternoon shift ended, and he still hadn't appeared, mill supervisor James Crawford organized a search party. They found Heinrich's body at dawn the following day, broken against the rocks at the bottom of Raven's Gorge, nearly 3 miles from his usual route home. The scene troubled everyone who witnessed it. Heinrich lay twisted at an unnatural angle, his neck clearly broken, but his clothes were hardly torn, and there was surprisingly little blood for such a violent fall. More puzzling still, his leather work boots showed no mud or debris that would suggest he had been walking along the treacherous gorge path in the dark. His lunch pail sat unopened beside him, the apple and bread inside still fresh, as if he had been carrying it when he fell, but had never eaten his midday meal. Sheriff William Callahan, a political ally of Mayor Cooperfield, conducted what he called a thorough investigation, but his conclusions seemed hastily drawn. He determined that Heinrich had been taking a shortcut home through the hills, had lost his footing in the darkness, and had fallen to his death. Case closed within 48 hours. No questions asked, no witnesses sought. But Martha Cooperfield had been present at the mill office that afternoon, when Heinrich's absence was first noticed, having stopped by to discuss arrangements for the annual harvest dance that the mill sponsored each October. She observed the worried conversations between the supervisors and noticed something that seemed to escape everyone else's attention. Heinrich's time card showed that he had signed out at exactly 5:30 p.m. the previous evening, his normal quitting time. But his signature looked shaky, uncertain, nothing like his usual careful penmanship. More troubling to Martha was her husband's reaction when she mentioned Heinrich's death at dinner that evening. Theodore had gone very still, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, and had asked several specific questions about who had found the body and what Sheriff Callahan planned to do about the investigation. When Martha wondered aloud whether Heinrich might have been meeting someone in such a remote location, Theodore's response was sharp and immediate. "Martha, it's not appropriate for you to speculate about such matters. The man had an accident. That's the end of it." But Martha's mind worked differently than most people's. She had spent years cataloging the behavioral patterns of Millbrook's residents, and she recognized when someone was lying or hiding something important. Her husband's reaction contained too much specific concern for a man who should have been hearing about Heinrich's death for the first time. That night, alone in her study, Martha opened a new journal, a brown leather volume she had been saving for the new year, and wrote her first entry about Heinrich Zimmermann's death. She recorded the date, the circumstances as she understood them, and most importantly, a detailed account of her husband's reaction and his specific questions about the investigation. She had no clear idea what it all meant, but her instincts told her that Heinrich Zimmermann had not died from a simple accident. Those instincts would prove correct in ways that would ultimately cost Martha her life. Over the weeks following Heinrich Zimmermann's death, Martha Cooperfield began to pay closer attention to the conversations that swirled around her during social gatherings and political meetings. As the mayor's wife, she was privy to discussions that most citizens never heard, and she started to notice references to things that didn't quite make sense, cryptic mentions of the arrangement, whispered conversations about keeping the books balanced, and an unusual frequency of private meetings between her husband and a small group of Millbrook's most powerful men. The group seemed to consist of 5 individuals beyond Theodore: Sheriff Callahan, mill supervisor James Crawford, bank president Charles Hartwell, Judge Samuel Brennan, and Dr. Marcus Fielding, who served as both the town's primary physician and county coroner. Martha had known all these men for years through social functions, but she began to observe them with new eyes, noting how they seemed to communicate through meaningful glances and carefully chosen words during public gatherings. In November, a second death occurred that deepened Martha's suspicions. Patrick O'Sullivan, a 28-year-old Irish immigrant who worked as a bookkeeper at the Millbrook Bank, was found drowned in the Susquehanna River. Like Heinrich, Patrick was known as a reliable, family-oriented man who had never shown any tendency toward reckless behavior. Unlike Heinrich, however, Patrick had been seen arguing with someone outside the bank just 3 days before his death, though witnesses couldn't agree on who he had been arguing with or what the dispute concerned. Dr. Fielding ruled Patrick's death an accidental drowning, noting that the young man had consumed alcohol before entering the water. But Martha learned from Patrick's widow, Bridget, that her husband rarely drank and had seemed worried about something at work during his final weeks. Bridget mentioned that Patrick had spoken of numbers that don't add up and had been staying late at the bank, apparently trying to reconcile some discrepancy in the accounts. Martha began walking past the bank during her evening strolls, noting which windows showed light after normal business hours. She discovered that the building was frequently occupied well into the night, with lamplight visible in both the main banking floor and the upstairs offices where the records were kept. On several occasions, she observed her husband's carriage parked behind the building, along with those of other members of what she had begun thinking of as the group. Her journal entries from November and December 1881 reveal a growing pattern of suspicious deaths and questionable circumstances. She documented not only the deaths of Heinrich and Patrick, but also began researching earlier incidents that she had previously dismissed as unrelated accidents. Her meticulous research revealed that over the past 2 years, 7 men in Millbrook had died under unusual circumstances, all of them immigrants, all of them employed in positions that gave them access to financial records or sensitive information about the town's major businesses. The most chilling discovery came in mid-December, when Martha decided to visit the courthouse to review public records. Judge Brennan's clerk, a nervous young man named Thomas Waverley, initially refused to let her examine certain documents, claiming they were restricted for official business only. But Martha's charm and social position eventually persuaded him to grant her access to probate records, property transfers, and business licenses. What she found in those dusty files would later fill 17 pages of her final journal. A complex web of financial manipulation that involved fraudulent land deals, embezzled bank funds, and a systematic pattern of eliminating anyone who might expose the conspiracy. The 7 dead men had all, at various times, been in positions to discover evidence of the ongoing fraud. Heinrich Zimmermann had been responsible for maintaining production records that would have revealed systematic overbilling of government contracts. Patrick O'Sullivan had access to bank records that showed mysterious transfers of funds between accounts controlled by members of the group. Martha's December 30th journal entry, one of the last she would ever write, contained a stunning revelation. She had discovered that her own husband was not merely a participant in the conspiracy, but appeared to be its mastermind. Theodore Cooperfield had been using his position as mayor to facilitate fraudulent government contracts, manipulate property assessments, and coordinate the cover-up of evidence through Sheriff Callahan's deliberately inadequate investigations. But Martha had made a critical error in her research. She had been too thorough, too careful, too systematic. Thomas Waverley, the courthouse clerk who had provided her access to the records, was Judge Brennan's nephew and had been reporting her activities back to his uncle from the very beginning. The first week of January 1882 brought a blizzard that isolated Millbrook from the outside world for several days, trapping residents in their homes and creating an atmosphere of claustrophobic tension that seemed to settle over the town like the snow itself. During those windswept days, Martha Cooperfield made the most dangerous decision of her life. She decided to confront her husband directly about what she had discovered. Theodore had been spending those storm-bound days in his study, claiming to work on municipal business, but Martha had noticed that he received several visitors despite the treacherous weather. Sheriff Callahan arrived on snowshoes on January 4th, followed the next day by Dr. Fielding on horseback, and finally by Judge Brennan, who came despite the risk and stayed for nearly 3 hours behind the closed door of Theodore's office. On the evening of January 6th, as the storm finally began to clear, Martha waited until Theodore had finished his dinner and was settled in his chair beside the fireplace. She had rehearsed her approach carefully, planning to present her concerns as those of a worried wife rather than an accusing prosecutor. But as she began to speak, laying out the pattern of deaths and the financial irregularities she had discovered, Theodore's expression changed from surprise to cold calculation. "Martha," he said quietly, setting down his newspaper, "you've been very busy, haven't you?" The tone of his voice made her blood run cold. This was not the husband she had lived with for 9 years. This was a stranger wearing Theodore's face, speaking with a voice devoid of warmth or recognition. "I've been concerned," she replied, trying to maintain her composure. "About the town, about these poor men who've died, about things that are none of your concern." Theodore interrupted. "Martha, I'm going to ask you once, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. What have you done with the information you've gathered?" The question confirmed her worst fears. Somehow Theodore already knew about her research. Her visits to the courthouse, her conversations with the widows of the dead men. The conspiracy was more extensive and more carefully monitored than she had imagined. "I haven't done anything," she said, which was technically true. She had written everything in her journal, but had not yet decided how to use the information. "I was hoping you could help me understand." "Where is it?" Theodore's voice was barely above a whisper now. "Where have you written down these concerns?" Martha's heart began to race. She realized that she was in immediate danger, that the man sitting across from her was capable of the same violence that had claimed Heinrich, Patrick, and the others. But she also realized that her journal, hidden in her study upstairs, was the only evidence that existed of the conspiracy, and possibly her only protection. "Theodore, you're frightening me," she said, rising from her chair. "I think I should retire for the evening." But Theodore was faster than she expected. He crossed the room and blocked her path to the stairs with a movement that was casual but unmistakably threatening. "The journal, Martha. I know you've been keeping a journal. I know about your visits to Thomas Waverley, your conversations with the widows, your late-night walks past the bank. Did you really think no one was watching? Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Millbrook intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next." Martha realized in that moment that her husband had been monitoring her activities for weeks, possibly months. Every careful step she had taken to investigate the conspiracy had been observed and reported back to the very people she was investigating. She was trapped in a web that had been closing around her since the day Heinrich Zimmermann died. "I need to think," she said, trying to buy time. "This is all so overwhelming. Perhaps we could discuss it tomorrow, when I've had time to—" "No," Theodore said flatly. "We'll discuss it now. You're going to give me that journal, Martha, and then you're going to forget everything you think you've discovered." If you do that, if you can be sensible about this, then perhaps we can find a way forward that doesn't require drastic measures." The threat was unmistakable. Martha knew that Heinrich Zimmermann and Patrick O'Sullivan had probably heard similar words shortly before their deaths. But she also knew that giving up her journal would mean signing her own death warrant. Without that evidence, she would simply become another convenient accident waiting to happen. "I need a moment to collect myself," she said, gesturing toward the stairs. "May I please go to my room?" Theodore studied her face for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Of course, my dear. But Martha, don't keep me waiting long, and don't do anything foolish." As Martha climbed the stairs to her study, she could feel Theodore's eyes following her. She knew that he would not let her live through the night unless she could find some way to turn the tables on the conspiracy that had already claimed so many lives. Martha's study was a small room at the front of the house, furnished with a writing desk, 2 chairs, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that held her collection of journals dating back to her school days. The window faced east toward the town square, and on clear nights she could see the courthouse clock tower and the dim lights of the business district. Tonight, with snow clouds still obscuring the moon, the view was lost in darkness. She moved quickly to her desk and opened the bottom drawer where she kept her current journal hidden beneath a stack of household correspondence. Her hands were shaking as she turned to a fresh page and began to write what she feared might be her final entry. January the 6th, 1882, 9:30 p.m. Theodore knows everything. I believe my life is in immediate danger. If something happens to me, the evidence of the conspiracy is documented in the previous pages of this journal. Heinrich Zimmermann, Patrick O'Sullivan, and 5 others were murdered to protect a fraud involving government contracts and bank funds. Theodore Cooperfield, Sheriff Callahan, Judge Brennan, Dr. Fielding, Charles Hartwell, and James Crawford are all participants. They have been watching me for weeks. If I die tonight, it will not be from natural causes, regardless of what Dr. Fielding reports. As she wrote, Martha could hear Theodore moving around downstairs, the creak of floorboards, the sound of the front door opening and closing, muffled voices in the hallway. He was not alone. Someone else had arrived, probably more than one person, despite the late hour and difficult traveling conditions. Martha finished her entry and closed the journal, but instead of hiding it in the drawer, she slipped it inside her thick winter coat. If she was going to die tonight, she was determined that the evidence would not die with her. She had already decided on a desperate plan that might preserve both the journal and her life, but it would require perfect timing and considerable luck. She waited 10 minutes, allowing time for Theodore and his visitors to settle into whatever conversation had brought them out in such weather. Then she opened her study door and listened carefully to the voices drifting up from the parlor below. She could distinguish at least 3 different speakers: Theodore, Sheriff Callahan, and what sounded like Dr. Fielding's measured tones. Moving as quietly as possible, Martha crept down the hallway to the back stairs that led to the kitchen. The servants had been given the evening off due to the storm, so the rear of the house was empty and dark. She pulled on her heaviest boots and wrapped her coat tightly around the hidden journal, then slipped out through the kitchen door into the snow-covered backyard. The cold hit her like a physical blow, and the wind whipped snow into her face with stinging force. But Martha pressed forward, following the fence line toward the neighbor's property. Her plan was to reach the Hendricks house, 2 doors down, where she could hide the journal and send a message to authorities outside Millbrook, perhaps the state police in Harrisburg, or a federal marshal who wouldn't be part of the local conspiracy. But as she reached the corner of her own property, Martha heard something that made her freeze in terror. The sound of men's voices calling her name, and the yellow glow of lanterns moving through the snow behind her house. Theodore had discovered her absence much sooner than she had hoped. "Martha, Martha, come back inside before you catch your death." Theodore's voice carried clearly through the winter air, but there was no warmth in it, only a predatory patience that suggested he knew exactly why she had fled. Martha ran. She stumbled through the deep snow between houses, her heavy skirts catching on fence posts and her boots slipping on ice-covered steps. Behind her, the voices grew closer and more urgent. She could hear Sheriff Callahan barking orders to other searchers. Apparently they had brought additional men to help locate her. She reached the Hendricks house and pounded on the back door, but the windows remained dark and no one answered her desperate knocking. The family had probably taken shelter with relatives during the storm, leaving their house empty just when Martha needed help most. With no other options, Martha turned toward the town center, hoping to reach the railroad station or perhaps find someone else awake despite the late hour. But as she struggled through the snow-covered streets, she realized that the lantern lights were following a systematic pattern, cutting off her escape routes one by one. This was not a panicked search by a worried husband. This was a carefully coordinated hunt by men who had practice at tracking people who knew too much. Martha's strength was beginning to fail her. The heavy snow, the bitter cold, and the terror of being pursued were taking their toll. She needed shelter, somewhere to rest and think, somewhere to hide the journal where it might be found by honest investigators after her death. The church, St. Catherine's Episcopal Church, stood at the corner of Main and Church Streets, less than 2 blocks from her current position. If she could reach it, she might be able to hide the journal somewhere inside where it would eventually be discovered by someone not connected to the conspiracy. But as Martha approached the church grounds, she saw something that destroyed her last hope. Lamplight flickering in the windows of Pastor Henley's residence beside the church building. Pastor Henley was her own uncle, her father's younger brother, and she had planned to seek his help. But the presence of multiple lanterns suggested that Theodore's search party had anticipated her destination and had already positioned someone there to wait for her. With nowhere left to run, Martha made one final desperate decision. Rather than enter the church where she might be trapped, she circled around to the cemetery behind the building, where dozens of headstones created shadows and hiding places among the snow-covered graves. She found what she was looking for near the back of the cemetery. A large granite monument to the Caldwell family, with an angel figure whose outstretched wings created a sheltered alcove. Martha dropped to her knees behind the monument and frantically began digging through the snow to the frozen ground beneath. The cold was so intense now that her fingers were becoming numb, but she managed to scrape away enough earth to create a shallow depression beside the base of the monument. She wrapped her journal in her scarf and placed it in the makeshift hiding place, then covered it with dirt, snow, and a few loose stones. As she finished, Martha heard footsteps crunching through the snow nearby. Multiple sets of boots, moving methodically between the rows of graves, searching every shadow and shelter. They had found her. There she is. Sheriff Callahan's voice cut through the winter night as his lantern illuminated Martha's figure crouched behind the Caldwell monument. "Theodore, we've got her." Martha rose slowly, raising her hands to show she was not carrying any weapons, though she doubted that would matter to the men surrounding her. In the flickering light of 4 lanterns, she could see Theodore, Sheriff Callahan, Dr. Fielding, and James Crawford forming a semicircle around the monument. Their faces were grim and determined, like men who had come to finish an unpleasant but necessary task. The wind had died down slightly, creating an eerie stillness among the snow-covered headstones. Martha could hear her own breathing, rapid and visible in the frigid air, and the soft crunch of boots on snow as the men adjusted their positions to block any possible escape route. The lantern light cast dancing shadows across the carved angels and granite crosses, creating an almost theatrical backdrop for what she realized would likely be her final conversation. "Martha, my dear," Theodore said, his voice carrying false warmth that made her skin crawl. "What on earth are you doing out here in this weather? You'll catch pneumonia." The irony of his concern for her health wasn't lost on Martha. She studied her husband's face in the lantern light, searching for any trace of the man she had married 9 years earlier. But Theodore's eyes were cold and calculating, the eyes of a stranger who had been playing a role for their entire marriage. How long had he been planning this moment? How long had he known that their relationship would eventually come to this deadly conclusion? "I needed air," Martha replied, surprised that her voice remained steady despite her terror. I felt faint after our conversation. Of course you did, Dr. Fielding interjected smoothly, stepping closer with his medical bag clutched in his gloved hand. The stress of learning about your husband's important work for the community can be overwhelming for a delicate constitution. Perhaps I should examine you when we return to the house. Martha understood the subtext perfectly. Dr. Fielding was already preparing his diagnosis. A weak heart, brought on by the excitement of the storm and the strain of venturing out in dangerous weather. Heart failure, just like Heinrich Zimmermann's official cause of death despite his broken neck. Just like Patrick O'Sullivan's drowning, officially attributed to intoxication and poor judgment. She noticed that Dr. Fielding's medical bag appeared unusually heavy for a simple house call, and she could see the outline of several glass vials through the worn leather. How many times had he carried those same implements to eliminate inconvenient witnesses? How many death certificates had he falsified to protect the conspiracy's secrets? The examination can wait, Sheriff Callahan said impatiently, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. We need to settle this business first. Mrs. Cooperfield, you've caused quite a stir tonight with your nocturnal wanderings. James Crawford, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private. If anyone sees us out here, no one is out in this weather, Theodore said firmly. And this won't take long, will it, Martha? The confidence in his voice chilled Martha more than the winter wind. These men had clearly done this before, multiple times, and they had developed a routine that minimized risk while maximizing efficiency. They spoke like businessmen discussing a routine transaction, not murderers planning to kill a woman in a cemetery. Where is it, Martha? Theodore asked quietly, taking a step closer. The journal. You didn't have time to destroy it, and you certainly didn't leave it in the house. Where did you hide it? Martha remained silent, but her eyes involuntarily flicked toward the base of the monument where she had buried her evidence just minutes earlier. The movement was almost imperceptible, but Theodore caught it immediately. He had always been good at reading people. It was one of the skills that had made him successful in politics and apparently in murder. Ah, Theodore said with satisfaction. Right here, isn't it? How convenient. James, would you mind checking around the base of this monument? I suspect our dear Martha has been doing some winter gardening. Crawford moved toward the monument with his lantern, illuminating the disturbed snow and exposed earth where Martha had frantically dug her hiding place. Within moments, he had located the wrapped journal and pulled it from its makeshift grave. Got it, Crawford announced, brushing snow and dirt from the leather binding. Looks like she tried to bury it pretty deep. Martha's heart sank as she watched her husband examine the journal in the lantern light, flipping through pages of her careful documentation. All her evidence, all her proof of the conspiracy's crimes was now in the hands of the very men she had been trying to expose. 17 pages, Theodore murmured as he scanned the contents. My, Martha, you have been thorough, haven't you? Names, dates, financial records, even diagrams of the bank's layout and security procedures. This is quite comprehensive. Dr. Fielding peered over Theodore's shoulder, reading Martha's neat handwriting in the flickering light. She knows about the chloroform, he said quietly, and the staged accident sites. She's documented our methods in considerable detail. Too much detail, Sheriff Callahan added grimly. If this information reaches the wrong people. It won't, Theodore said firmly, closing the journal and tucking it inside his coat. Because we're going to resolve this situation right now, permanently and completely. Martha found her voice at last. You killed them all, she said, no longer trying to hide her knowledge. Heinrich discovered the fraudulent contracts, didn't he? And Patrick found the missing money in the bank records. How many others knew pieces of your scheme? Theodore tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether to answer her question. Too many, he replied simply. But that problem is nearly solved now. Once we dispose of you and your inconvenient curiosity, Millbrook can return to normal operations. The contracts will continue, the profits will flow, and no one else will need to suffer unfortunate accidents. Heinrich trusted you, Martha continued, surprised by her own boldness in the face of death. He came to you when he noticed the discrepancies in the production records, didn't he? He thought you would help him understand what was happening. A small smile played at the corners of Theodore's mouth. Heinrich was a good man, honest, hard-working, devoted to his family. Those are admirable qualities, but they can also be dangerous qualities when applied to the wrong situations. Yes, he came to me with his concerns about the government contracts. And yes, I helped him understand what was happening. Just before Sheriff Callahan and I helped him take that unfortunate fall at Raven's Gorge. The casual admission of murder sent a chill through Martha that had nothing to do with the winter weather. Theodore spoke about Heinrich's death the way another man might discuss a minor business transaction, with no trace of guilt or regret. "And Patrick?" Martha asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Patrick was more problematic," Dr. Fielding interjected. He had discovered discrepancies in multiple accounts, and he was asking questions that could have exposed the entire operation. Unlike Heinrich, who came to us directly, Patrick was conducting his own investigation, making copies of documents, preparing to contact authorities outside Millbrook. "So you drowned him," Martha said flatly. "I sedated him first," Dr. Fielding replied, as if this detail made the murder more humane. A small injection of morphine, administered during what appeared to be a routine medical examination for a work-related injury. He was unconscious before he hit the water. There was no suffering. Martha stared at the four men surrounding her, trying to comprehend the scope of their callousness. They had turned murder into a systematic process, complete with medical protocols to minimize their victims' awareness of what was happening. How many times had they refined these techniques? How many innocent people had died to protect their financial scheme? "The others?" Martha asked. "Samuel Kowalski, Michael Brennan, Thomas Muller, William O'Brien, Joseph Santini." Sheriff Callahan answered this time, his voice matter-of-fact. "Various methods depending on the circumstances. Kowalski fell from the mill's loading dock. Tragic accident during his night shift. Michael Brennan encountered some ruffians on his way home from the tavern. Unfortunate case of robbery gone wrong, though oddly enough his wallet was never taken. Thomas Muller had a hunting accident while cleaning his rifle. William O'Brien and Joseph Santini both suffered from sudden heart attacks, thanks to Dr. Fielding's medical expertise. Each death was carefully planned and executed to appear completely natural or accidental," Dr. Fielding added with what sounded like professional pride. "The key is understanding each victim's habits, their likely locations, and their personal circumstances. Samuel worked late shifts alone at the mill, so an industrial accident was believable. Michael frequented taverns in rough neighborhoods, so a robbery made sense. The others required more creative approaches." Martha felt sick listening to these men discuss murder with the detached professionalism of craftsmen describing their trade. But she also realized that their willingness to explain their methods suggested they had no intention of letting her live long enough to repeat what she had heard. "Why?" Martha asked desperately. "Why kill all these people for money? How much could possibly be worth so many lives?" Theodore laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Martha, my dear, you still don't understand the scope of what we've accomplished here. This isn't about stealing a few $1,000s from the town treasury. We've created a system that generates enormous wealth while remaining completely invisible to outside oversight." He gestured toward the town below them, barely visible through the swirling snow. "Every government contract awarded to Millbrook businesses passes through my office. Every property assessment that determines tax rates is influenced by our recommendations. Every bank loan that finances local expansion requires our approval. We've essentially privatized the entire local government while maintaining the appearance of democratic governance." Crawford nodded enthusiastically. "The mill alone has generated over $40,000 in fraudulent revenue during the past 2 years. The mining contracts have produced another 60,000. Add in the property speculation, the manipulated tax assessments, and the loan schemes, and we're approaching $200,000 in total profits. The enormity of the financial conspiracy stunned Martha. $200,000 was more money than most people in Millbrook would see in multiple lifetimes. It was enough to buy political influence at the state level, enough to corrupt judges and law enforcement officials across western Pennsylvania. And the best part, Sheriff Callahan added, is that our methods are completely exportable. We've already established similar operations in 3 other towns, and we're planning to expand the network throughout the region. Within 5 years, we could control local government and commerce across half of Pennsylvania. Martha understood now why they were willing to kill so many people to protect their secret. This wasn't just a local conspiracy. It was the foundation of a criminal empire that could eventually extend across multiple states. The men standing around her weren't just murderers. They were pioneers of systematic corruption on a scale that could undermine democratic government itself. But surely someone will notice, Martha said. State officials, federal investigators, journalists from the bigger cities. Not if we're careful about eliminating problems before they become too visible, Theodore replied. That's why people like Heinrich and Patrick had to die. They were beginning to see patterns that could expose the entire operation. And it's why you have to die tonight, Martha. You've seen too much, documented too much, understood too much. Dr. Fielding stepped forward, pulling a white cloth from his medical bag. Theodore, we should finish this quickly. The longer we remain out here, the greater the chance of being observed. But Martha had one more card to play, a desperate gambit that might save her life or at least ensure that justice would eventually prevail. I mailed copies, she said loudly, her voice carrying across the cemetery. 3 days ago, before the storm, I sent copies of the most important pages to the Attorney General in Harrisburg, to the U.S. Marshal's office in Philadelphia, and to the editor of the Pittsburgh Gazette. Even if you kill me and find my journal, the evidence is already in the hands of people you can't control. The lie was delivered with such conviction that all 4 men hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances in the flickering lantern light. Martha could see doubt creeping into their expressions as they realized that killing her might not be enough to protect their conspiracy. She's lying, Crawford said, but his voice lacked certainty. The storm has prevented any mail from leaving town for days. Before the storm, Martha repeated firmly. On January 3rd, the last day, the mail coach ran before the weather turned. Check with the postmaster if you don't believe me. Ezra Wainwright will remember the 3 letters I posted that afternoon. I told him they were Christmas greetings to relatives, but he'll remember the official government addresses on the envelopes. Theodore's face had gone pale, and Martha could see him calculating the implications. If she was telling the truth, then killing her would actually make things worse by confirming the accuracy of whatever evidence she had sent. But if she was lying, then they still needed to determine whether anyone else knew about her investigation before proceeding with her murder. What exactly did you send them? Sheriff Callahan demanded. Word for word, what did you write? Martha's mind raced as she tried to construct a believable lie that would buy her more time. I sent copies of the bank records showing the fraudulent transfers, along with documentation of the connection between Heinrich's death and his discovery of the contract irregularities. I told them that if anything happened to me, they should investigate the entire Millbrook power structure for systematic corruption and murder. The detail in her lie was convincing, but Martha could see that Theodore was beginning to doubt her story. He knew his wife well enough to recognize when she was improvising, and he understood that she wouldn't have had access to bank records detailed enough to prove the financial conspiracy. Show me your hands, Theodore said suddenly. What? Martha replied, confused by the unexpected request. Your hands, Martha. Show me your hands. Reluctantly, Martha pulled off her gloves and extended her hands toward the lantern light. Her fingertips were stained with ink from her frantic writing session earlier that evening. But more tellingly, there were no traces of the special red wax that the post office used to seal official correspondence. You haven't been to the post office in weeks, Theodore said with renewed confidence. Ezra uses that red sealing wax on all outgoing mail, and it stains the fingers for days. You're lying, Martha. You haven't sent anything to anyone. Martha's heart sank as she realized that her desperate gambit had failed. These men knew her too well, understood her habits too completely, to be fooled by even a carefully constructed lie. Where is the journal, Martha? Theodore asked again, but now his voice contained a note of desperation. If you've really sent copies elsewhere, then the original won't matter. Tell us where it is, and perhaps we can find a way to resolve this situation that doesn't require permanent solutions. Martha almost smiled at the transparent attempt at negotiation. Even if she had sent copies, which she hadn't, these men could never afford to let her live. She knew too much, had seen too much, understood too much about their methods and their victims. But her lie had bought her a few more minutes of life, and sometimes a few minutes could make all the difference. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, Martha heard something that made her heart leap with hope. The sound of a church bell tolling midnight, followed immediately by voices calling her name from the direction of the town square. Someone else was searching for her, someone not part of the conspiracy. "Theodore!" a voice called from somewhere beyond the cemetery fence. "Theodore Cooperfield, we know you're out there!" Sheriff Callahan cursed under his breath and extinguished his lantern, motioning for the others to do the same. Suddenly, the cemetery was plunged into darkness, with only the faint reflection of snow providing any visibility. "Who is that?" Crawford whispered urgently. "Pastor Henley," Martha said, recognizing her uncle's voice. "And he's not alone. I can hear at least 3 other men with him." Theodore grabbed Martha's arm roughly, his fingers digging into her flesh through her thick coat. "If you make a sound, if you try to signal them, I'll kill you right here with my bare hands," he hissed in her ear. But Martha had already made her decision. She had spent the past months documenting evidence of systematic murder, and she was not going to die silently in a cemetery while her uncle and his companions searched for her just a few hundred yards away. "Help!" Martha screamed at the top of her lungs. "Help me, I'm in the cemetery, they're trying to kill me." Theodore's hand clamped over her mouth, but her cries had already carried across the snow-covered ground. The voices from the town square immediately changed direction, moving toward the cemetery with obvious urgency. "Damn it!" Sheriff Callahan snarled. "We have to get out of here, now." "Not without dealing with her first," Dr. Fielding insisted, fumbling with his medical bag in the darkness. "If she talks to them, there's no time," Theodore said, releasing Martha's arm. "We'll have to find another way." But Martha was already running toward the approaching voices, stumbling through the snow between headstones and monuments. Behind her, she could hear the 4 conspirators arguing in urgent whispers about whether to pursue her or retreat while they still could. "Martha." Pastor Henley's voice was much closer now. "Martha, where are you?" "Here," Martha called back, waving her arms despite the darkness. "I'm here, near the Caldwell Monument." Lantern light appeared at the cemetery gate as Pastor Henley and his search party entered the grounds. Martha could see 4 figures moving cautiously between the graves, calling her name and sweeping their lights across the snow-covered landscape. When they finally reached her, Martha collapsed into her uncle's arms, sobbing with relief and terror. Pastor Henley wrapped his coat around her shivering form, while the other men, members of his congregation whom Martha recognized, formed a protective circle around them. "What happened, child?" Pastor Henley asked gently. "We've been searching for you for hours. Your husband came to the parsonage, said you had wandered out into the storm, and he was worried sick about your safety." Martha looked back toward the Caldwell Monument, but the conspirators had vanished into the darkness, leaving no trace of their presence except for the disturbed snow where they had confronted her. She realized that even now, even with witnesses present, she was still in mortal danger. Theodore and his associates would not simply abandon their plan to kill her. They would find another way, another opportunity, another method that would appear natural and avoid suspicion. "They tried to kill me," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "My husband and the others. They've been murdering people to cover up their crimes, and they tried to kill me too." The men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly struggling to believe such an accusation against the town's most respected citizens. Pastor Henley looked particularly troubled, torn between his desire to help his niece and his reluctance to accept such shocking allegations against men he had known and trusted for years. "Martha, you're clearly distraught," Pastor Henley said carefully. "The storm, the cold, the stress. Perhaps you've misunderstood something." Theodore seemed genuinely concerned about your welfare when he came looking for help. But Martha could see the doubt in her uncle's eyes, and she realized that even her narrow escape from the cemetery would not save her. Without the journal as proof, her accusations would be dismissed as the hysterical ravings of a woman driven to madness by winter weather and domestic stress. And once these well-meaning witnesses departed, Theodore and his associates would have another opportunity to eliminate the threat she represented to their conspiracy. As Pastor Henley and his companions escorted Martha home through the snow-covered streets of Millbrook, she understood that she had won only a temporary reprieve. The real confrontation was still to come, and next time, her enemies would be better prepared. The voices calling Martha's name belonged to a search party organized by Pastor Henley, who had grown concerned when he noticed lantern lights moving through the cemetery near his church. Unlike the conspirators, Pastor Henley had enlisted help from members of his congregation, honest citizens who had no knowledge of the financial fraud or the systematic murders that had been disguised as accidents. As the church-organized search party approached the cemetery, Theodore and his associates found themselves caught in an impossible situation. They could not murder Martha in front of witnesses, but they also could not allow her to speak freely about what she had discovered. In those crucial moments of indecision, Martha made her escape, running toward the approaching lanterns while screaming for help at the top of her lungs. But her victory was short-lived. While Pastor Henley and his volunteers escorted Martha safely home that night, she had revealed too much of what she knew during the terrifying confrontation in the cemetery. Theodore and his associates now understood that Martha posed an existential threat to their conspiracy, regardless of whether she had actually mailed copies of her evidence to outside authorities. Over the following days, as Millbrook slowly dug out from the blizzard and normal activities resumed, Martha found herself increasingly isolated. Friends and neighbors who had previously welcomed her company now seemed uncomfortable in her presence, as if they sensed some unspoken danger surrounding her. She realized that word of her accusations had spread through the tight-knit community, forcing residents to choose sides in a conflict that most of them didn't fully understand. Martha spent those final days completing her journal, adding detailed accounts of the cemetery confrontation and her growing certainty that Theodore and his associates would not allow her to live much longer. She wrote with the focused intensity of someone recording a final testimony, documenting names, dates, methods, and motives with the precision of a professional investigator. On January 18, 1882, 12 days after the cemetery confrontation, Martha made her last journal entry. "They are closing in. I can feel it in the way Theodore watches me, in the way Dr. Fielding asks too many questions about my health, in the way Sheriff Callahan finds excuses to visit our house. I have hidden this journal, where it may someday be found by honest investigators, but I fear that day will come too late to save me. If I die in the coming hours or days, please remember that I loved this town and its people enough to risk everything to protect them from the evil that has taken root among us." That evening, Martha Cooperfield was found dead in her locked study, apparently having suffered heart failure while writing in her journal. Dr. Fielding conducted a brief examination and pronounced the death natural, noting that Mrs. Cooperfield had complained of chest pains and breathing difficulties in recent weeks, symptoms that several witnesses confirmed, though Martha had never mentioned such problems to her closest friends. The journal found beside Martha's body contained only household accounts and social observations, according to Sheriff Callahan's official report. He noted that while Mrs. Cooperfield had been somewhat excitable during the recent blizzard, there was no evidence of foul play or suspicious circumstances surrounding her death. The case was closed within 24 hours, and Martha was buried 3 days later in a simple ceremony attended by most of the town's prominent citizens. But Martha Cooperfield had been more clever than her murderers realized. The journal found beside her body was indeed filled with household accounts. It was an old journal from 1879 that she had deliberately placed on her desk as a decoy. Her real journal, containing 17 pages of devastating evidence against the conspiracy, remained hidden behind the Caldwell Monument in St. Catherine's Cemetery, wrapped in her scarf and protected from the elements by a small wooden box she had managed to procure during her final days. The conspiracy continued for 3 more years, claiming 2 additional victims before finally collapsing in 1885 when a state banking inspector noticed irregularities in the Millbrook Bank's records during a routine audit. The subsequent investigation revealed systematic fraud involving government contracts, property manipulation, and embezzled funds. But the connection to the mysterious deaths was never officially established. Theodore Cooperfield and his associates were convicted of financial crimes and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, but none were ever charged with murder. Martha's journal was discovered in 1923, 41 years after her death, when groundskeepers at St. Catherine's Cemetery were relocating graves to make room for a new church building. The wooden box had preserved the leather-bound book and its contents remarkably well. And when local historian Dr. Rebecca Thornton examined the journal, she immediately recognized its significance. Dr. Thornton's subsequent research corroborated many of Martha's observations and accusations. County records from the 1880s showed the same pattern of suspicious deaths that Martha had documented, along with financial irregularities that matched her detailed accounts of the conspiracy. More importantly, Dr. Thornton discovered that Martha's description of the confrontation in the cemetery was supported by previously overlooked testimony from Pastor Henley, who had written in his own diary about the strange circumstances of that January night and his growing suspicions about Martha's subsequent death. The revelation of Martha's journal created a sensation in Pennsylvania legal circles and led to a broader investigation of historical corruption in small-town governments throughout the state. While none of the original conspirators were still alive by 1923, the evidence Martha had preserved helped authorities identify and prosecute similar schemes in other communities, potentially saving countless lives and preventing millions of dollars in additional fraud. Perhaps most remarkably, Martha's journal contained detailed instructions for detecting the specific methods used by the conspiracy to disguise murders as accidents. Her observations about the subtle inconsistencies in crime scenes, the patterns of victim selection, and the coordination between corrupt officials became a handbook for investigators dealing with similar cases. Several unsolved deaths from the 1880s and 1890s were reclassified as homicides based on techniques Martha had developed for recognizing the signs of systematic murder. The final entry in Martha's journal, written just hours before her death, proved to be prophetic. "I may not live to see justice done, but I believe that truth has a way of surviving even when those who speak it do not. Someday, someone will find these words and understand what really happened in Millbrook. When that day comes, I pray they will have the courage to act on what they learn, and that my death will not have been in vain." Dr. Thornton's investigation ultimately revealed that the Millbrook conspiracy had been part of a much larger network of corruption involving political machines, railroad companies, and banking interests throughout western Pennsylvania. Martha Cooperfield's meticulous documentation became the foundation for understanding how such networks operated and how they could be dismantled through careful investigation and cross-referencing of public records. Today, Martha Cooperfield is remembered as one of America's first investigative journalists, though she never published a word during her lifetime. Her methods of documenting evidence, analyzing patterns, and preserving testimony have influenced investigative techniques used by law enforcement and journalists for over a century. The Martha Cooperfield Institute for Government Accountability, established in Millbrook in 1982 on the centennial of her death, continues to train investigators in techniques she pioneered for exposing corruption and solving cold cases. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Martha's story is how ordinary the conspirators appeared to their neighbors and friends. Theodore Cooperfield, Sheriff Callahan, Dr. Fielding, and the others were respected members of their community, men who attended church regularly, supported local charities, and participated in civic organizations. Their ability to commit systematic murder while maintaining facades of respectability demonstrates how evil can flourish when good people choose to look the other way or trust authority figures without question. The house where Martha and Theodore Cooperfield lived still stands on Elm Street in Millbrook, though it has been converted into apartments and bears little resemblance to the Victorian mansion where Martha spent her final days documenting the conspiracy that would cost her life. Local residents report that the second-floor room that served as Martha's study remains difficult to heat, even during mild winters, and that visitors sometimes feel an unexplained sense of urgency when standing near the window that faces the town square. More significantly, investigators have noted that Martha's techniques for detecting patterns of systematic murder remain remarkably effective for solving modern cold cases. Police departments across the country now use training materials based on her journal entries to help detectives recognize when apparent accidents or suicides might actually be connected, homicides designed to silence witnesses or eliminate threats to criminal organizations. This mystery shows us that the most dangerous conspiracies are often those that hide in plain sight, protected by the respectability and authority of their participants. Martha Cooperfield died because she possessed the intellectual courage to question what everyone else accepted and the moral courage to document what she discovered even when she knew it would cost her life. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there might be more secrets still buried in Millbrook's past? Leave your comment below and let us know what you think really happened during those terrifying months in 1882. If you enjoyed this tale from America's dark past and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations, and share this video with someone who loves unsolved mysteries. Until next time, remember that the truth has a way of surviving, even when those who speak it do not. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another dark chapter from America's hidden history.